All right. The state itself comes from its sovereignty, and the sovereignty is its capacity to exhibit force through the military. All martial activity is sustained and organized effectively through hierarchy. All sovereignty requires hierarchy. Because of this, all military personnel who put their life on the line and are willing to fight for the state, they understand in terms of human life what is required to sustain the state. Any new political system, even if it's superior to a dictatorship, would still require a dictatorship temporarily. As a transition, a new system needs an organizing element and something to impose structure, especially in times of social instability, which is usually when this new political change would occur. So theoretically, if democracy was the best system, it would need to be established first. So a system not sufficiently democratic or not democratic at all can't use democratic means, at least not reliably, to establish a more perfect democracy. Right, so like you can't vote a king, an absolute monarch, out of office. That just like doesn't exist. So, and then, you know, if you're living in more of an oligarchy where money secretly controls the levers of a system that might formally be democracy, you can't use purely democratic means to vote out the oligarchs, because effectively the democratic means are just for show, because oligarchs already control the election. So, like, you know, this is just in theory, but like, you would need a military leader or somebody, a leader willing to take up arms to actually implement democracy if you wanted it. So even thoroughly democratic movements need hierarchy. So as a metaphor, right, there's only one way to make a perfect arrowhead. Sure, you can craft multiple different types of arrowheads, but according to the laws of physics and aerodynamics, you would need to improve any of these diverse arrowheads in particular ways to make them function better as arrowheads. And so a government is the same way. You can make a government any kind of way you'd like. You can imagine any kind of political theory or economic theory, but fundamentally, to make a system the most efficient or to bring about the most efficient political change, you need to improve it within a particular set of ways that is defined by some kind of actual law. And I don't mean just the laws that we draft. I just mean like the natural law, I guess you could call it. Human nature. So a state, a military, bureaucracy, etc. It's the same way. It requires the same kind of hierarchy. Even somebody like Mao Zedong recognizes this. If you take his writing at face value, he's radically pro-democracy. And he thinks that like the military should be democratic and that all institutions should be democratic and egalitarian. But looking at his own political system, how it's actually implemented effectively to win power in China against the Japanese, the nationalists, and the warlords, he just had to act in specific ways that would most efficiently bring about total control over the country. And this is aside from any kind of theoretical ideology. So even anarchy, which is a totally decentralized system, would only theoretically succeed, could actually only it could only in reality succeed temporarily against the failure of a dominant military power. If you had no military hierarchy, you had no bureaucratic hierarchy, you had no set system of supply chains and division of labor, and everything was just up to the individual or small groups, you'd only be able to win against a military superpower if that military power temporarily failed in some way. And the success of an anarchist revolution would not abolish all state power, all power imbalance whatsoever, and it wouldn't abolish other states in other places or states in your home in the future. All it does is abolish the legal norms of the state and maybe gutting the bureaucratic apparatus of the state, but it doesn't abolish mankind's capacity for violence, and it doesn't abolish material hierarchies or material inequalities, the inequalities within our own faculties from person to person. Even an anarchist revolution would require some kind of organization and would probably lead to another organization anyway, which would absolutely need some kind of implementation, which would naturally look dictatorial, at least for a period of time. Okay, so now I'm going to give a critique of democracy. So first of all, competition between factions in society, without any kind of overarching judge or chief decider in the state, these factions will just divide the country's resources and pit it against their own country, and this impedes political development. It also slows down the development of the state in general. If issues are overly politicized, the implementation of each policy will be based on what faction you personally belong to, and something that could generally be good for society might be something that you would shoot down if you were in the government, or if there was some kind of general vote on a particular policy. If it just was implemented or suggested by the opposite faction, the opposing faction, you would have an incentive to shoot it down because you have loyalty to your party, basically over your country, or over the state. That's another thing with leaders as well. People will blame issues on the current leader that actually, in a democracy, at least here in America, your leader is only the leader for 4 to 8 years. So people will blame things on the current leader that were actually gestating for 10 years prior to that, or 5 years prior to that, or the blame will go on the wrong person. Even worse, people who sympathize with the current leader will defend any decision that they make by blaming all of the issues on the previous leader, right? So there's basically no ability for anyone in a democracy to actually take responsibility for their actions. You can always, if it's good, you can always take credit for something that's not what you implemented, and if it's bad, if the policy is poor, you can always say, oh, well, this is actually the other team in my government, or this is the guy that was in charge last time. And the periods of time where one is in office is so short that you can really do this. You can never take responsibility for your actions, and you can never, as a citizen, get to the bottom of who's really in charge, or who is responsible for a particularly good or particularly poor implementation of a policy, because the sovereignty of the state is so opaque in a democracy. Another problem is that under a democracy, there's no incentive to fix problems in a timely manner, because then there would be no reason to elect a member of that party or that same politician again if all of your problems are solved. Imagine we only had 5 problems, and then you elect somebody into office and they're so efficient at their job and they just get all 5 of those issues. I mean, what's the next election going to look like? What are people going to debate about? They're going to split hairs over really stupid things, I think. If all of our problems are solved, they would need to, but people would be comfortable, and it would feel kind of maybe superficial or artificial to come up with such silly issues. And I think what we see then is that politicians never solve real issues. They can't, because of the amount of bureaucracy and party politics, but they also have no incentive to, and instead they run on all these really minute or unimportant issues that are just blown way out of proportion. They would affect 1%, 1 to 5%, max of the population, and they're blown into proportion where the fate of the country is contingent on whether or not 51% of the population will vote for this thing or the next, and it's completely artificial in its form. So another problem is that democracies only select leaders based on their capacity to win elections. Politicians are just good at winning the popular vote or the vote from their cadres in their party. I mean, we've gotten to a place in society where calling somebody a politician is almost derogatory because it just means that you're manipulative and focused on rhetoric. Okay, so now I have a few points on why dictatorship might actually be a good system, how it could be a good system. Because at first I just laid out arguments for why it would be necessary for political change. But obviously that doesn't explain what that change would be. And you can direct a tool, even if it's a useful tool, you can direct a useful tool for something that's evil. And I think we're very aware of that in our society, of how a dictatorship would be evil. But as we laid out, talking about democracy and anarchy and these things, there is still hierarchy in outwardly egalitarian systems. There is still an oligarchy that's just necessitated by having to manage a large amount of things. There's a dictatorship or an autocracy necessary in having to decide what a new political system would look like. So if democracies impede political development through their politics, but then are secretly oligarchies, clearly the superiority of dictatorship would be the opposite of this. It would be that it ends the political squabbling that hold back policy making, and it makes its hierarchical tendencies more pronounced and more out in the open so that people can just see it. It's a public dictatorship rather than a secretive dictatorship. This would allow society to harness all of its productive and policymaking expertise and enterprise in a way that does not contradict and tear down other elements in society through this bipartisanship that is so present in electoral politics. Under a dictatorship, everyone would blame the country's problems on the leader, naturally. I mean, we still do, but at least this way there would be one leader for a lifetime or until they stop doing a good job. When you have one man who has absolute power over the state, there's no one else to blame for your country's problems. The difference between an elected president in our situation and this dictator, aside from the length that they're in office possibly, would be the fact that if you blame your country's problems on the dictator rather than the president, the dictator is the person between the two that actually has the power to change the country. They have the power to boss around the other elements within society and cajole them to a more satisfactory arrangement, and one that will keep the dictator alive and in office longer, which would certainly be in the dictator's best interest. There's also something to be said about the fact that this kind of military strongman is such an old system. It's very primeval in that way. When an ancient tribe of people or an ancient kingdom needed a hero, the most capable man was made the leader. He was given the seat of power and the ability to exercise sovereignty over this ancient state. So when there is somebody who is so clearly elite in all their capacities, or at least in the important capacities, they should be brought to the helm of the state. Now, the video isn't going to be on monarchy by any means, but a slight edge that a monarch or a kingship would have over a dictatorship proper would be that after the dictator dies or is overthrown, there's still this political struggle to get the next person in charge, which still happens under a democracy. It just happens more frequently, and it's in this very legalized form. But under a monarchy, it doesn't suffer from the problems of a dictatorship or a democracy, in that the person who is to be the heir is pretty clear in that it's probably the oldest son who's just going to inherit the crown. And so there's no squabbling at any point in the political process. Also, if you're a king, you're going to think about what your country will look like for your children and your children's children and your great grandchildren. You're going to want the country to be intact so that they can actually inherit power. They can inherit a country. And so you're going to be thinking in much larger time scales. And it's generally more of a stable system unless the monarchy is just so abysmal that you have to overthrow it. But then usually there is somebody who is superior in one way or another that ends up taking power. And even if they're not called the king, maybe they're called the general secretary or the president or generalissimo, they're still going to be king-like. They're going to be autocratic. So, I mean, with all of these arguments out of the way, the one question that remains is that if any system is going to have hierarchy and a democracy is just a less responsive, more secretive, and oligarchic form of hierarchy, how much democracy then would be necessary in any political system if they're all going to in some way or another resemble a dictatorship?